The opinions expressed on the radio program by the hosts, co-hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions and responsibility of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Genesis Radio, www.genesisradio.com, Genesis Radio's owners, management, or affiliates.
It's another Thoughtful Thursday, and you're on air with Reason for Reason, and I'm your host, Ron Yates. So today I want to talk about an ongoing situation in Central Africa. It's one of those forgotten wars. I don't want to say forgotten. You don't really forget the wars. What happens is these wars are underreported. In this country, we're well aware of the conflict, the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We know about the situation in Israel between Benjamin Netanyahu's forces and the civilian population of Gaza. But there is a war that has been going on almost as long as the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But sadly, in this country, most of us have never heard of it. Could it be because this war is taking place on the continent of Africa? This war I'm speaking of started in March of 2022 when forces from Rwanda, which sits to the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, launched an invasion into the neighboring country of the DRC. Now, the name of the country itself, the Democratic Republic of Congo, why would not the U.S. take an active role in ending this conflict? We are the protectors of freedom, the guardians of democracy, yet nothing's being done to assist this democracy. And why? Why is the question? Why is this conflict allowing to go on? Why is it that there's no reporting in the mainstream media? Perhaps it's because this conflict that supposedly is about protecting a rebel group, it's more so about control of vital minerals. The Democratic Republic of Congo, years ago known as Zaire, is a veritable storehouse of some of the most valuable minerals on the planet, from diamonds to gold to tin to lithium. And we all know the value of lithium in this country and around the world. So, of course, there's this ongoing fight around the world for control of the world's remaining sources of minerals. I mean, we just had what we saw last Friday was the dressing down of President Zelensky of the Ukraine. He was here in this country at the White House to sign a mineral agreement with President Trump. From that, the meeting devolved into madness. One of the things that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, said is that, have you said thank you to President Trump? Why would you say thank you to someone who you're going to sign an agreement with to give them about half of your mineral worth? Who should be saying thank you to who? But I digress. Let's go back to the Congo. Congo has a long and troubled history. In the late 1950s, early 60s, the Congo was under the control of the government of Belgium, actually the king. I believe it was King, oh, I can't think of his name right now. It'll come back to me. King Leopold, actually. And they were exploiting the country for its vast store of rubber plants. And the control by the Belgians was brutal. People were being mutilated. People were being killed. The country, with all its vast resources, the people were starving and hungry. Enter into that situation was a man by the name of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba had an idea of freedom, not just for the Congo, but all of Africa. He was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. But we found out some years later, that the Belgians, the English, and of course the Americans decided he had to go. In fact, there is now declassified information that strongly suggests that President Eisenhower gave the okay to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. After the death of Lumumba, one of his lieutenants, a man by the name of Joseph Mobutu, who had been pretty much a right-hand man to Lumumba, who Lumumba promoted to the rank of colonel and put him in charge of the force publique, or I guess the equivalent of the national police for the Congo. Well, apparently someone, perhaps a three-letter agency, starts with C, ends with A, got to him, told him if Lumumba's gone, all of this will be given to you. Shortly thereafter, Patrice Lumumba was captured. He was brutally beaten and eventually assassinated. Unfortunately, by his own kith and kin. Then the country of the Congo underwent some changes. The name was changed to Zaire. Many of us, what we know about Zaire, we probably remember the historic fight between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. I think that was around 1978. Why would the US government allow such a huge spectator event to be held in a country that is controlled by a brutal dictator? And why is it now that that country is a democracy, why is nothing being done to assist them? It's very interesting, but it is all part of American business. America has a vital interest in controlling natural resources, particularly mineral resources. At this time in history, most of the world's mineral resources are in control of the Chinese, approximately 70%. In order to get control of some of these minerals, that if they cannot buy you off the president, sometime they'll fight proxy wars. And that's what's happening between Rwanda and the DRC. Now let's talk a little bit about the president of Rwanda, a man by the name of Paul Kagame. When Kagame was elected, and he's been in office now, going into his 25th year, how does this man manage to stay in power for so long? We'll come back to that. Kagame was born in Rwanda, part of the minority Tutsis, who for many, many years controlled the governance of Rwanda. When he was just a small child, there was an uprising, and he and his family had to flee their native Rwanda, and he was raised in Uganda. And he worked his way up through the ranks of the Ugandan military. He was a high-ranking military official in the Ugandan army. And he assisted in the ouster of the aforementioned Joseph Mobutu, also known as Mobutu Sese Seko. They then installed in power a new president, assisted by Kagame. Well, before long, Kagame decided that he had to go and launched a war in Uganda for control. Well, that's how it begins for Mr. Kagame. At some point, he returned to Rwanda. And while he was there, I suspect that a three-letter agency starting with C ending in A, and possibly the British MI6, approached him. Them knowing the amount of mineral wealth in the DRC, no way they could not get their hands on it. So Kagame now is in a position of power in Rwanda. He's part of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. But was he being patriotic, or was he in the process of gaining power? Power that is unchecked, unquestioned. Again, he's been there since 2000, 25 years. Throughout his life, or his adult life, he's been involved in one conflict after the other. Now, Rwanda is a small country. I'm sure they have some resources, nothing that will rival the Congo. But where's he getting all this money to fight these wars? Planes, bombs, tanks, feeding your army is not cheap. So who's supporting him in these wars? That's the question that we have to explore. Where's the money coming from for Paul Kagame to continue these wars against his neighbors? And why is it only the countries that have vast mineral resources? Well, by the early 1990s, tensions were brewing in Rwanda again between the Hutu and the Tutsis. We all know, those of us of my generation, we know about the Rwandan massacre, that civil war that erupted, that cost the lives between 400 and 800,000 ethnic Tutsis, of which Kagame is a Tutsi. Well, what caused this conflict to boil over was the downing of the plane carrying the presidents of both Burundi and Rwanda. The Hutus, who were the majority in Rwanda, blamed the Tutsis. Now, years later, decades later, it has come out that Paul Kagame, our friend Paul again, had a hand in the downing of this plane. This plane was struck by either a missile or an RPG. Something brought this plane down. And now it is said that Kagame has basically admitted to some of his underlings that yes, it was he and the Rwandan Patriotic Front that brought down this plane. Why would you cost the lives of 400,000 to 800,000 of your fellow Tutsis? I think the answer is that somebody wanted Paul Kagame in place. I think they knew that with him, they would have a reliable source who would give them access to what they wanted, that being control of the minerals. Now, what's interesting was, or is rather, prior to the downing of the plane, when the conflict is starting to boil over, Paul Kagame was not in Rwanda. In fact, he wasn't even in Africa. Where was Paul Kagame? He was at the U.S. Army General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, studying field tactics, psychological operations, and propaganda techniques. Why would you take a guy from a small country in Rwanda, like Rwanda, bring him to this country and train him in these techniques? Hmm. There's a book by Judy Rebels, and it's called The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And one of the passages in the book talks about a fair-haired boy of the CIA and the British MI6. They were speaking about Paul Kagame. In fact, there was an FBI agent assigned to investigate the downing of the plane that took the life of the president of Rwanda and also Burundi. And his investigation showed that it was Paul Kagame who actually gave the order to bring this plane down. And years later, the same man involved in wars in Uganda, changing of, I guess the word is what the Bush administration liked to use, regime change. He oversaw regime change in Uganda. And now it looks like he's trying to do the same thing in the DRC. Well, let's talk a little bit about the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. As I said before, this country is loaded with mineral wealth. Literally billions, perhaps trillions of dollars. Most of their resources are in the eastern half of the country, along the border with Rwanda. Rwanda actually began this conflict by saying they were supporting a group called M23. Well, why not just negotiate peaceful terms? Why resort to war against your neighbor? Except the fact that there is probably pressure on Mr. Kagame to get control of the resources. So that, of course, how business is done, multinational corporations can get in there and start shipping out the minerals, start to make hundreds of millions of dollars off the misery of the people of Congo. You know, Africa, the second largest continent, the continent blessed with almost all of the resources. There are very few resources you will not find in Africa. And yet, it is arguably the poorest of the continents, particularly for its size. Who's the most wealthy continent? Probably Europe. For its size, Europe has abundant wealth. No material wealth or mineral wealth. Their wealth comes from exploitation. The colonial powers fanned out all over the globe, and they took what they wanted and they held on to it. For many, many years, they had their colonial agents in these countries. Eventually, they wanted to appear to give independence to these fledgling nations. So they would take a black man, a brown man, put them in charge. But were they really in charge? Who was giving the orders? Who was directing that country's policies? Economic, political, social? One of the things that is quite prevalent throughout what's called the third world, because there's so many resources found in these places, but not a lot of capital with which to buy the equipment, build the facilities so that they can produce their own materials. Most of them are shipped to Europe or to American places like that, fashioned into, you know, gold or diamond jewelry, and then sold back to the Africans at prices they simply can't afford. But we're not just talking about gold and diamonds, we're talking about strategic metals. We're talking about the metals necessary to produce weapons, nuclear weapons. We're talking about materials or minerals like lithium. We all know how often lithium is involved in some of these fires that are breaking out from these lithium powered bikes and things of that nature. For all of these electric cars, battery powered cars, where are they getting the minerals to do that? That's why it is so important for these corporations and these countries that back these corporations to get control of the world's resources. Suffering does not matter to them because for the last nearly 3 years, this war has been raging. No one has reported it, no cameras, very little in terms of print information is available. It took me a little digging to find out the stuff that I did. Yet why aren't we talking about this? Isn't this war just as important as what is happening in Ukraine? What is America's interest in, say, the Middle East, in Gaza? I know President Trump has been talking about taking control of Gaza and turning it into the Mediterranean of the Middle East. But how do you do that when there are millions of people who call that area home, who have been there for centuries? Well, America has a great deal of interest in Africa. It is vital for America and their Western allies to recolonize the African continent from north to south and from east to west, because those are where the treasures are to be found. There and in what's called the Middle East, which is nothing but another portion of Africa. For Paul Kagame, I remember when he was elected, he seemed to be a breath of fresh air for Africa. He seemed to be amongst those African leaders, those progressive African leaders that wanted to move the continent forward. Well, that was all for show. Now we know the real Paul Kagame. He's a butcher, he's a dictator, and he's a puppet of the West. And he's killing people in the neighboring country for control of resources that do not belong to the Europeans. I went back and I looked at some things, and going back into the 1990s, I'm talking when the Civil War was going on in Rwanda, and I can remember a picture in Time magazine. There was a waterfall. There were so many bodies you couldn't see any water. Just a sea of bodies going over a waterfall. With that amount of killing going on, there was an article, I believe, in the UN Charter, that states genocide has to be stopped. Well, the Tutsis were being slaughtered. Why didn't our government take action? We now know that the Clinton and the Bush administrations supported President Kagame. They knew full well that he was responsible for the downing of this plane and the start of the war, but that didn't matter. President Clinton urged the removal of UN forces. That left the people with no protection. Why? You know, this war, unless we begin to show or shed some light on it, nothing's going to happen. Our government will ignore this war. The media will ignore what's going on. It's up to us to speak out, to ask questions like what's going on in and around Africa? Why is it we, those who are supposed to be the protectors of democracy, are not protecting a democracy in Africa? Why are we allowing these people to die? Why hasn't the head or the president of the DNC or DRC been invited to the White House like Zelensky was? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this war that no one wants to talk about. These dirty little secrets that we think will stay in a dark corner, but they don't. They always get out. And someone begins to shed light on it and make the administration begin to answer some tough questions like, what did you know and when? And what is your plan to end this conflict? We know that Trump said on day one of his presidency, the war between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky would come to an end. Well, here we are in his third month, and the war is still going on. And I don't know if there's really a clear end in sight for the war in East Africa or Central Africa. There is no end in sight. This war is not about idealism. This was not about, as in the case of Russia and Ukraine, it's not about a rising neo-Nazi extreme right-wing elements in Ukraine. This war is about one thing, and it's about minerals, African minerals, that are going to be, of course, shipped out of Africa, shipped to places like Europe, into America, so that a small group of people can further enrich themselves. How much money do they need? For somebody like Elon Musk, a man with more than $100 billion, who just got another, I believe, $2.4 billion contract from the government for one of his companies called Starlink. This guy is throwing people off of the payroll. And yet, he's telling them that they're wasteful, telling these hardworking people, you don't have a job anymore. But he just is now signing another contract with the government, $2.4 billion. So if the people are the problem, what is the deal with you making all this money off of the people? Who's really the problem? And isn't that a conflict of interest? That the person who's taking your job is now signing more contracts with the government. Why would our government give him more contracts, especially at a time like this when there's so much uncertainty as it relates to government employees? So, folks, I think it's time now that we begin to take off, I guess they're called the rose colored glasses, and begin to really look at what's happening, not just in this country, but around the world. Some of the things that America is doing in the name of the American people has been wrong from the beginning. A lot of us don't know what's happening, and a lot of us simply don't want to know. We There's an old saying that ignorance is bliss, and we prepare to be, and we prefer to be blissfully ignorant. Folks, with that being said, I'm going to open up the phone lines. The number here is 888-304-4401. Again, 888-304-4401. If you have any comments or questions related to what we talked about thus far, anything on your mind that you want to ask about or have a comment about, give us a call here at the station. And hopefully we can answer some of your questions. Anyway, what's happening in this country, I'm going to move away from the DRC and Rwanda for a bit. We're just going to talk about some of the current events in this country. And I've been talking with a lot of people on social media. And it seems as if that a lot of people who initially supported our current president, there are a number that are beginning to have some serious doubts about him. He's already gone back on many of the promises that he made, like ending the war, like bringing down inflation. Since he's been in office, the price of eggs have doubled. Gas prices on the rise. Food prices as a whole on the rise. And now our president, who once referred to himself as being a stable genius, has decided to enter into a trade war with Canada, China, and Mexico, three of our largest trading partners. Trump, it seems, does not have any particular policies, at least none that you could point to and say, well, this is a written policy of the U.S. government. It seems that Trump has ideas. It's like when he was running for president and he was doing a debate with then Vice President Kamala Harris. One of the questions she posed to him was about health care. He's talked about from the beginning, from his first term, eliminating the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare. But when she asked him about a plan, he said, I have an outline of a plan. You want to dismantle healthcare for millions of poor and working class people, but you don't have a clue of what you're going to do to replace it, or if you're going to replace it. Now we have a man in office who simply does not have any policies. He just wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to institute tariffs. I think it's the most beautiful word in the English language. So I'm going to institute tariffs. Has anybody seen what's happening with the stock market? Since he's taken office, or for the last several weeks, the market has been tanking. We're looking at a little segment of the news before I left to come into the studio. And the president said, I'm not watching the market. Well, Mr. President, what the hell are you watching? Where are you getting your information from? What makes you think announcing tariffs against your largest trading partners is a good idea? All of the economists and now heads of major corporations saying, Mr. President, this is a bad idea. This is going to hurt American business, hurt American consumers. In fact, I believe it was the CEO of Ford that said, Mr. President, this is a very bad idea. It's going to drive up the cost of production of cars dramatically. Some people are saying between, I think, $2,000 and $7,000 in additional cost to purchase a car. And with so much economic uncertainty, who's going to make those big purchases? If you're a government employee, do you really think you're going to buy a house right now? A car? Take a vacation? It's possible that you can go home prepared to go on vacation. And while you're headed to the airport, get a text or email that says, no need in coming back on vacation because you've just been fired. This is the new reality in America. This is something we have not seen in decades. Our government seems to think that there was a problem with diversity, equity, and inclusion. The general who was in charge of the Virginia Military Institute, black man, who just had his contract extended a couple of years back, in February, or just last month, was unceremoniously fired. Why? He said himself, because I'm a black man. And the image they want to portray of leadership is not a black man. That's why the general who was in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, also fired. What had C.Q. Brown done wrong? According to the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who has about as much military experience as Popeye the Sailor, he said, well, under CQ or General Brown, there was a number of DEI initiatives brought into the ranks of the military. Now let's think. Yes, the military does establish certain rules and regulations. But as it relates to DEI, is it possible that that came from further up the chain? Was that not part of the Biden administration, some of Biden's policies? How does the general in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff go against the president and decide not to institute some of the rules and regulations that are handed down from the White House? Well, while General Brown was being fired, it was a woman, Caucasian woman, who was in charge of the Navy. She also was fired. She also is supposedly a victim of DEI. Trump talks about meritocracy, those who earn their positions. I'm sorry, did Pete Hegseth earn his position? What about Kash Patel? How much experience does he have running an organization like the FBI? Our current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, she was Trump's attorney. How much actual experience does she have running a department like the Department of Justice? But we're talking about meritocracy. Well, Mr. President, what did you earn in life? Since you want to talk about meritocracy, you got money from your father. I believe it was $400 million that daddy left you. And of course, you blew through that, just as you built a lot of monstrosities that didn't last very long. I think that the Trump Taj Mahal now is either a parking lot or it's a new casino. He thought that was a really good idea. He thought that because of the name Trump on the outside of this building, that it would make $1 million a day, which would be required just to make the payments to the various banks for his loans. He'd been told, Mr. Trump, no casino makes $1 million a day. But he was convinced, just as he's convinced now, that tariffs are a good thing. He was convinced then that nope, the name Trump is on it. People will come from far and wide. Well, how'd that work out for him? Then you had Trump Airlines. Well, the name Trump is on the planes, so of course, people will come from far and wide to ride on Trump Airlines. How'd that work out for him? Then, of course, you had Trump University. Well, of course, with the name Trump on the university, students will flock to it from all over the world. This Center for Higher Learning, right, specializing in, I guess, business, will attract students from far and wide. Well, where is Trump University now? What's the current enrollment? What about their endowment? That's right. They don't exist anymore. Just like none of his businesses he started exist anymore. Well, I know there are a lot of people who may be listening who still are in favor of Trump, still strong supporters. There are a lot of states in this country. I hate to use the term red and blue states, but a lot of people in this country, in these Democrat or Republican held states, are beginning to feel some pain that they could never have imagined would affect them. They didn't think that they would lose their jobs. They didn't think that their workers would be too afraid to come to work and would be rounded up and sent not only back to their home countries, but sent to places like Cuba, Guantanamo. Isn't that where we sent 9/11 to quote unquote alleged terrorists? Are these people terrorists now? What terrorist act did they commit? Oh, I know they're accused of being drug addicts, that they're bringing drugs, that they're violent. Some of these people, in truth, were incarcerated in their home countries. Some of them do have some felonies on their record, but I'm willing to bet you none of them have 34. Well, that's another story. It'd be interesting to see what happens now with men and women coming home from incarceration. Are they going to be given a chance to get a job? I'm talking about a decent job. Some of these people will take advantage of their incarceration and get a degree, maybe 2 degrees, maybe even a doctorate. When they come out, will they be afforded the same opportunity that Donald Trump received? You know, while I'm focusing on the top of the ticket in the Republican Party, I think it's important for people to understand, and I want you to hear me clearly. It's important for people to understand Trump is not God. I know there are a lot of people that think he's right up there, but you're a damn fool. And there is a God that is really in charge. And for those of you that think that Trump has some ability to change things, well, just look carefully. He's changing things all right, but he's not changing them for the better. He's doing the best he can. And unfortunately, he surrounded himself with people who are never going to tell him, Mr. President, you can't do that. Mr. President, maybe you should reconsider. He surrounded himself with people who are going to do exactly as they're told, no matter how detrimental it is to the people of this country and to the people of the world. China said that they are ready to respond to an economic war or any kind of war this country wants. China is fed up. China's tired of being blamed for everything, for trade imbalance, for control of the minerals that they say they're getting, I don't know, using other than legal methods. China's sick of it. So when this country announced tariffs, China in response also placed tariffs on products to be imported into China. So for those business people that supported Trump, where are you going to sell your agricultural products to now? How much is it going to cost you now? Down in Kentucky, which is one of those so-called red states, by the way, one of the poorest in the country, they produce whiskey down there, whiskey, bourbon. Canada has taken every bit of it off the shelves and is not importing any new products, any new whiskeys or liquor products from this country. People in Kentucky are already starting to grumble. This is what you wanted. This is what you chose. So when you don't really understand who it is you're electing to office, you listen to what they have to say, even though it may not make sense, but because you wanted it for reasons far beyond his policies, because he don't really have any. That was evident in his debate. You ask somebody who for years, he was the president, left office 4 years. That's 8 years he had to contemplate, what am I going to do if I get rid of what's called Obamacare? And yet he said, I have the outline of a plan. And now what he's doing, he did an address just the other day. He got it before America and he lied. And yet there are still people that sat there and listened to those lies with all this hope, with all this promise. Well, I can make a prediction. What he said ain't coming true. None of it. Is the war over between Russia and Ukraine? That was day one, remember? That's still going on. He talked about the economy and how Biden was the problem. how when he got in office, he was going to bring those prices down. Well, that's strike two. And now it's the workers. Hundreds of thousands of people who voted for him, who put their faith in him, are now trying to figure out, how am I going to keep a roof over my head? How will I feed my children? And his people within his administration and some of the elected officials, some of the really smart ones like um, Miss Green from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that mental giant, she said that government workers do not deserve their paychecks. Government workers show up to work on a daily basis. Members of Congress, some of them don't even show up for important bills. And how many months out of the year do they actually work? They're off for the summer. They're off for all the major holidays. They travel the country on the taxpayer's dime. One term in Congress. After one term, you have a pension for life and health care for life. Just think about that for a second. People work 30 and 40 years, and when they leave the job, will lose their health benefits. Members of Congress will serve 2 years. Some won't show up for caucus meetings or for votes, and they'll be entitled to a pension and health care. These are the same people that tell you that health care is a right and not a privilege. They have it, it's okay. You have it, it's a problem. They talk about, what does it cost for health care? What does it cost to fight these damn wars? They never ask that question. What did it cost us to fight for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan? Some estimates over $2 trillion. And what did the American people get for 20 years of warfare? Body bags? People coming home with horrible injuries, physical, emotional, psychological, coming home to inadequate VA facilities. Jobs weren't very plentiful when these guys came back, and there's still none. Somebody said it's a good idea, I guess it was Trump, to kick these people out of the country because, well, they're undocumented workers or undocumented migrants. But they were a vital part of our economy. Who's going to do it now? Are members of Congress now going to roll up their sleeves and wait tables? Are they going to go out and pick some of the produce that is now dying on the vines? Who's going to do that, Mr. Stable Genius? So I just think that it is time that people pay more close attention to what's happening. Most of us aren't going to say anything till it affects us directly. When the prices continue to rise and you can't put gas in your car and food on the table, then people will speak out. Then they will say, okay, maybe I made a bad choice. I talked to some of, people I know, people I used to work with, and they want to talk about this issue in terms of Democrats and Republicans. My thought on that is, this ain't got nothing to do with Democrats and Republicans. This has everything to do with people. People whose political persuasion may be Democrat or Republican, but both of them are suffering. If you work a federal job, nobody asked what your political persuasion was before they fired you. For these cuts that are being instituted, nobody asked what your political persuasion was before they decided to cut from health care, from Medicaid, from Medicare, before they decided to cut programs at schools. Nobody asked were the parents, were they Republican, were they Democrat? Nobody cares. Do you think Trump cares whether Republicans are suffering? Do you think he cares that the people that supported him are suffering? Here's the big question. Is Washington listening to them? Are they hearing them when they say our businesses are suffering? Are they hearing them when these people are crying out asking, what do I do now? I'm a veteran. I fought for this country. I got a job at a government agency, and now I've been fired. What did I do wrong? Did I not perform my job to the best of my ability? They say it's all about waste. Well, maybe it is about waste. But who created this waste? This waste was created by Congress. Acts of Congress. They created this bloated bureaucracy. And now the people who work in the bureaucracy are being fired. Congress is allowed to stay there. They created the mess, but they stay. The people who only want to keep a roof over their head and feed their kids, they're the ones that are being kicked out. And that makes sense? Where? So folks, I just wanted to come on today and just share a little information with you, about what's happening in Eastern Africa. It's really important that we know about this. It's really important that we understand the world we live in. And it's bigger than just the block you're on or the hood you're in. It's much bigger. Now we have the internet. Information can travel around the world instantaneously. And we're still focused on basically what's happening in our neighborhood, or maybe in the states and cities surrounding where we live. But it's much bigger than that. And we need to be aware, because if we're not aware, we suffer. And the suffering that is happening in this country that people are starting to feel, oh, this is just the beginning. Trump is just getting started. There's a lot more pain to go around. So folks, I hope you get something or got something out of this last hour. And I hope that it'll spark interest, not just in politics in this country, but what's happening around the world and how it affects all of us. A war in Africa, it has to have an effect on us. As I said, Rwanda is a small country. Where is this president getting all this money to continue to fight? Who's paying for the planes, the bullets? Who's paying for the tanks? Who's paying for the food and medicine for his soldiers? Maybe that money's coming right out of America's, at least classified budget. Money that could be going for health care, for Social Security, for Medicaid, for Medicare, for children in need. Instead, it's buying bullets. It's buying guns. So folks, I thank you for listening. We'll be back next Thursday with another Thoughtful Thursday. Until that time, stay awake. Y'all have a good weekend. Peace.